It's a long way to Tipperary, it's a long way to go. It's a long way to Tipperary, to the sweetest girl I know. Goodbye, Piccadilly.
Right, well, thank you very much. So the subject really is Canadian graffiti in Maison Blanche, which is a subset of a wider talk on souterrains. And we haven't talked too much about souterrains yet. And no expense has been spared in the generation of this slide, as you can tell. It's got a lot of sentimental value. But just a reminder from our speakers this morning, there are three basic types of tunnelling system underground. There's the serious fighting tunnels, of which the mines are put in these little rooms at the end and explode. There are 30 unexploded mines on the Western Front, British, and presumably a similar number of German ones as well. So the prime mission of the Durand Group is to investigate how to get into these fighting tunnels and to defuse those mines. But as you can tell, if I stand sideways, I'm starting to get a little bit too big. To climb through tunnels not much bigger than walking under this stage. So I don't tend to go in too much into those anymore. Far easier to go into are subways, and I'm sure just about every one of you has gone into the Grange subway at Vimy. That's one of 12 or 14 subways, depending on how you define one or two of them. And we've managed to get into just one of those, and there's therefore another 12 to get into. We've got into the Goodman, and you can buy the DVD at the back at a very reasonable price about the Goodman. And that's a wonderful system that's got loads of graffiti in, particularly up this end, where the soldiers are waiting to go into battle. It tends to be the density of the graffiti is higher at the battle end than the entrance end of a subway, as a rule of thumb. And we're trying to get into the Zivvy subway and also into another one called Tottenham. But we haven't managed to get into them yet, but we're working on those. And in behind the lines, we've got these sheltering caves, and they've been touched on a little bit by previous speakers. But these were made typically by medieval miners, 1600 to 1850, to extract chalk. And it seems a little bit of an unusual occupation for a farmer, but a farmer would work during the summer on the farm, and then in the winter he would dig out his souterrain. And to do that, he would go down, he would drop effectively a well shaft, a puit, a puits, if you speak better French than I do, which is basically a well shaft down. And then when he gets to the rock that's hard enough to be used as building material, he would then fan out from there and start to shape the blocks into bricks and create building material to build. Now, the reason they're doing that is that basically the whole of northern France, as we've heard, is the floor of an ocean, a shallow ocean that was on the equator about 40 million years ago. And therefore, if you want to dig and use blocks locally, and you couldn't afford to bring in limestone from Caen or Normandy or whatever, the only material you had was chalk. And therefore, just about most of the northern France, the buildings, the capital buildings and even farmsteads, etc., are made out of chalk. The reason, of course, you don't see them so much on the Western Front is that under reparations, they were allowed to build a facsimile of their previous farmyard, but in brick. And as a rule of thumb, brick became economically viable in about 1850, and that led to the demise of chalk quarrying. Now, having put your shaft down and dug out this very large cave, which is about the size of a church underground, you've now got somewhere where you can hide your family and your harvest and your livestock, because this whole of northern France is a bit like Syria today. It was a battlefield between the Flemish-speaking people trying to push south and the French people pushing north. And therefore, you built your farms in a square so you could close them up at night and defend them. And inside the square, you dropped your puit down and you built your sheltering cave. And in times of trouble, you could hide your family down here. Now, because of that, because their lives depended on the secrecy of where this cave was, there's an air of secrecy where these caves are even to this day. But the Germans systematically looked for these, as we did, and we have a German document that lists 300 that they know on their side of the line, and there's no doubt tens on our side still to be discovered. And what would be very exciting is to find one of those in its original medieval pristine condition. without being adulterated by First World War. Now, you've seen that slide before, but this shows that how the British troops were using these shelters underground. And they've put here at least 2 bunks. Oh, I've got my finger over the end, that's why you can't see. You've got 2 bunks. Sometimes there's even a 3rd bunk. And you can see, although it's slightly damp and not entirely wonderful conditions, it's better than being on the surface. And these are integrally quite strong. They can survive shell fire. They sometimes just rain a little bit of dust down under shell fire, which caused a bit of concern. But the thing to remark about these boys is how young they look. Don't you think they look really young? Great shame. And as was mentioned before, the 2 big systems under Arras, the Ronville system over here, and the Saint-Sauveur system. Now, you notice how these medieval caves were built alongside roads, because you obviously you shape the blocks, you want to get them onto carts and away to build the cathedral, etc. So typically they're alongside these major arteries going into Arras. And these were rediscovered. The French army systematically looked for these in about October 1914, and they were exploited by the British in 16 in readiness for the Battle of Arras in April 1917 by joining these together. These red blobs are the medieval caves. This is the Ronville system, and this is the Saint-Sauveur system. And we discovered this complex here from right up here from New Plymouth, Auckland, right down to Wellington in about 1994. They were known to some authorities in France, but the very bureaucratic culture of French, the people that were involved in the Cold War were using these for air raid shelters. They didn't tell the archaeologists about their existence, and they had to be discovered. And in the Saint-Sauveur system, even now, we don't know how to get into these caves here. The Ronville system became less strategically important in April 1917 because the Germans withdrew to the Hindenburg line in March, April, and they hinged the Hindenburg line on Arras. You imagine a door going that way, which meant that the Saint-Sauveur system became tactically a lot more important than the Ronville system. But the Ronville system still housed about 20,000 troops for a few nights in preparation for the battle. This here is the front line, and you can see that they're very close to it. Now, these troops are not the ones that are going to go over the top. That was, those guys were still in the trenches as in conventional warfare. But what could happen was that the British could resupply and reinforce at a tremendous rate that really surprised the Germans, far more than we've ever done in the past. Now, also, we found that isolated cave there, I think it was about 1998, Thompsons Cave, when some workers were building a gas pipe and they fell into the cave. Fortunately, they survived, and we spent about 2 years mapping this cave. As you can see, it is a complete underground hospital. It's got an officer's, it's all labelled here, but it's got an officer's ward, another ranks ward, a waiting area. It's even got a mortuary, a kitchen, a surgical area for operating. And I could give a whole talk on Thompsons Cave, but we're not going to talk about that. But there is the reason we had to keep it secret. All it was straight down into a footway under this house, and all that was in front of it was a metal sheet, and that's a very youthful Andy Robertshaw entering the system. Unfortunately, he came out again, but anyway, that's another story. The problem that the French government has, what do you do to these people in this house? Now, they were somewhat bemused to see 6 Brits keep going into this hospital day in, or this room, or apparently just down into this manhole, day in and day out. But if you tell the owners of these buildings that they've got a massive hole under their house the size of a cave, even Bruce wouldn't buy one of those, and he's an estate agent. So, so they have to keep it secret, and it was kept secret until we could put a proper manhole on there. The holy grail of souterrain hunting, and you could make your fame by doing it, is to get into Christchurch. It's the biggest system, it's the biggest cave of the system, and so far we've failed to get in because the obvious entrance is seriously blocked with very dangerous rock falls, and so far we haven't got in. I did phone the mayor of Christchurch in New Zealand and the local television company to say we're going to break in tomorrow, and they got all very excited, and I had to phone them again and say, no, we didn't. So we still haven't broken into Christchurch, but we think we know how to get in via this little cave here called Bluff. And hopefully, if I can get my colleagues to concentrate on souterrains instead of fighting tunnels, we may be able to get into there this year or next year. In the process of trying to find Christchurch, we discovered a cave here that was not on any map and not documented. And this is tentatively being called the Duran Cave. And what is interesting about that is it was totally set out for soldiers to use, but because of the pullback to the Hindenburg line, it was never actually occupied. So it's in pristine condition. There's no graffiti there, there's nothing. The rock beds around the pillars are ready for beds to be put in, but there's nothing there at all. So it'd be nice to go back into there. We haven't been in for about 10 years. And this is my favourite slide of all. If you map the names that the New Zealand Tunnelling Company gave to the caves as they joined them together by building the access tunnel between them, they named them Auckland, Wellington, Blenheim, Christchurch, and you map that across to New Zealand, it's an exact correlation to the shape and size of New Zealand. So somewhat amazingly, there's a map of New Zealand under the sidewalks of Arras. Now this is Taff Gillingham, I'm sure many of you know, and I have to say immediately he's not having a wee, because everybody thinks he's because this is the moment, this is well before Wellington was open to the public. I took Taff in about 96, and he immediately recognised the significance of this one pillar. Now you see here this original marking. This pillar was called 5E by the First World War soldiers, and it's got their battalion headquarters, and there are marks on candles on the pillar. And Taff immediately recognised what that was. The French didn't know what that was, and he knew what it was because he knew about this drawing. And this is Reverend Danvers having the Easter Sunday service just prior to the battle on the 9th of April on the next morning, Easter Monday, for the Suffolk Regiment. And he's standing at Pillar 5E with battalion headquarters and the arrow. And Taff knew about that drawing from the Illustrated London News. And if you look in a little bit more detail, you can see the 5E there, battalion headquarters and the arrow, the shape of that rock, and this original First World War electric cables here. And if you look again at Taff, he's standing with 5E, battalion headquarters, the marks from the candles, the shape of the rock, and the cable. So it's a remarkably accurate drawing that the guy did at the time, except he made one mistake. He did not realise that each one of these pillars has a unique number, so you can tell a section of a platoon. Your beds are under pillar 5E, that's where you go. And he's marked this pillar 5E as well. So he's made a mistake there in the drawing, because when we reconstructed the service for BBC News, and you can see there that he should have put 4G on that pillar, not 5E. So very interesting. But we're not going to talk about that. We're going to talk about Maison Blanche, which is another souterrain that we found about 5 years ago. Whilst we were filming a film on the Goodman subway with a Canadian film company that came out as a documentary History Channel called Heaven to Hell. And their researcher, Judy Rousselot, was looking for other potential places to have documentaries in the area. And she found, or was shown, a report that was done by a chap called Hervé Lemar, who went into this cave in 1990. He wrote a report, and it was given a copy to the director at Vimy, which was filed away, and then they remembered it and showed Judy, and she researched and found this cave at Maison Blanche. And we lifted the corrugated iron off, and we stared into the void there. And this is where Colin and Bruce come in, because Bruce and I were there, And the problem with this was that that entrance was full of rubbish. The farmer in the 1960s had been throwing all sorts of sacks, plastic sacks in, old bicycles, all sorts of things down. It was totally full, apart from about this much. And we decided that we were going to scramble all over this debris to get in. It's a 45-degree angle going down. And I decided to let Bruce go first. The only thing I checked was that he didn't have his kilt on at the time, because he was going in head first. And I followed him afterwards. And Colin comes in the story, because we met Colin in Arras that evening, and he went in the next day as well. So we scrambled all over the rubbish, and there we are. We've now cleared a lot of the rubbish, and we've decided that it's so interesting inside that we're going to dig out all this wash-in. This is all soil that's washed down the steps. And there's one of my colleagues at the back there digging away. I'm standing there with a clipboard measuring how many buckets he's doing. And eventually we cleared that whole of that entrance, and I even swept the steps. And that's what it looks like now. That's the entrance down into the system. And as you go in, this is what you see. Now, this is the same state that we found Wellington in, and it's now the museum that I'm sure many of you have been into. These are the medieval pillars coming down, and this is where the beds would have been all around the pillars. About 200 men were in this cave in 1917, and the floor is about 6 foot of the medieval miners' debris. As they shaped each block, they didn't bother to lift out all the spoil. They just trampled it down under their feet, and therefore this is the medieval floor. In some souterrains, the Royal Engineers put spoil from spoil heaps down, like in Wellington, to level out the floor as well. But this is basically medieval debris there. And this is a problem that you have with souterrains, in that because you've got a wider expanse of roof, unlike the fighting tunnels that are only this big, the roof is less supported, and there are flaws in the roof that were caused when the chalk was formed on the ocean floor. All these tiny little animals called coccoliths died, and they rained down onto the floor. You're supposed to say at this point, because they've all died. And they form chalk, which, as it's forming, has the consistency of toothpaste, but then as more pressure develops, it builds up into the strength of soap. And if there's a earthquake 40-odd million years ago, it fractured the chalk as it was being formed. So a lot of these weaknesses in the chalk are not modern. They're caused by earthquakes as it was being formed, and therefore chalk has a tendency to slab away, to fall away in blocks, which is the danger. It's even a danger today in Wellington, that the roof could slab away. Now you notice that when it does slab away, it does leave a nice bright mark. Now this is unnecessary black because this is the kitchen area of the hospital. That's why it's black. But we know that this colour, which that's what I call the weathered colour of the cave, we know that takes about 100 years to form, because when people have scratched and they've left a date, it takes about 100 years for that date to not be bright white and to get back to that sort of colour. So we know it takes about 100 years for that to go back to the weathered colour. That's assuming that industrial pollutions are the same. And therefore we know that the roof here in Maison Blanche has not come down for 100 years, because the roof is dark, it's not bright. It's a measure of how young the fall is. But none of this roof in Maison Blanche is white. So it's relatively safe to walk round. It hasn't come down for 100 years. And these are more professional photographs that have been taken of the system. You can see that it's quite beautiful in many ways. And you can't imagine the amount of man-hours it took to create these by the medieval farmers and miners. This is the extent of the cave, and this is the entrance here. You can see that it goes under the existing farm, and at this level, which we call High Hall, there's only about 2 or 3 metres between the roof of this cave and the farmyard. So one day, Monsieur the farmer is going to be nicely asleep, and he's going to have a hell of a ride as he rides down into the cave. This is the entrance we go in now. There clearly were entrances up into the old trench systems and possibly into French tunnelling systems. This road here marks the front line that the French had in 1915, and it even snaked around the back of the farm. Now, we know that the French did not discover this cave, nor did the Germans discover this cave, even though their front line virtually went right through this. This is the original medieval Puit, the entrance. We know that they didn't discover it because there's no French or German graffiti from 14 and 15 in the cave. The first graffiti is when the Canadians took over in late 1916. Now, what is unusual about the shape of this is that the Puit there is on one edge. Now, if you imagine that you're a medieval farmer and you drop your Puit down, your shaft, you get to the good quality brick to make your farmyard, you would naturally go out in all directions. You wouldn't go down one side because the quality of the chalk is the same everywhere. So why that Puit is on an edge is a bit of a mystery. And it may be that there's a whole complex of the cave here yet to be found that's hidden under all the farmers' rubbish, etc., that's down there. And this is the sort of graffiti that's there, a nice little yacht. And what is very, or not unique, but very common in this cave is that the Canadian soldiers are drawing their cap badges, their regimental badges. And this one is of very high quality. And I just realised, practicing for this talk, that when they made these would have been bright white. Now, Peter was talking about how dark it was in caves and just candles. You imagine if you've made some of these and they're glowing white around the cave when the rest of the cave is dark. They must have been quite amazing to see. Now, this is a sign that the morale was good with these soldiers. You do not spend 40 man-hours copying that badge if your morale is down, if you're against the war, etc. But the quality is very good, considering he started from the rough chalk. And then they do arty things. Now, I do say that this is after Mensch, the Scream, because that was only 4 years old at the time. And, of course, that shows my artistic prowess in saying that. The only trouble is, he's not actually screaming. So whether it really is, I don't know, but perhaps some arty people might be able to tell me more. But I do say on the guided tour that that is after Mensch, the Scream. And you do get the Canadians put in graffiti. Now, the amazing thing is that this cave has got 1,000 items of graffiti on the walls. 1,000. And this is typical. H. Bell, they give their number, which makes it a lot easier to trace. And this is in the classic purple pencil of the British Army. This chap seems to have survived the war, or if the only way he wouldn't have survived the war if he got himself promoted to lieutenant, because a Lieutenant Bell died in the last month of the war, but he seems to have survived. These three chaps didn't, unfortunately, and this is a little memorial done by the Black Watch to 3 of their colleagues that have already died, and they did a little drawing for these 3 guys as well. And then we've got A. Billings, Sniper Malone, he calls himself. And you can see how amazing, how sharp that is. Now, you would have thought intuitively that chalk, being slightly wet, that would have merged away and blurred away over 100 years. But that's as sharp today as when it was first put in. Now, these are very interesting characters because we think that these are medieval carvings. These are not First World War carvings. They're always on the edge of a wall into a room. And this guy is saying, my name's whatever, Pierre or something in Flemish. This is my room. I'm digging the blocks out of this room. And here's perhaps a nicer copy. And he's got a leather helmet on. And he's got a little place there for a blob of clay and a candle to put on his hat. And he doesn't look like a British soldier with that nose. He's almost certainly 1600, 1650, as late potentially as 1820, but I think he's about 1650-ish, 1700. And he's one of 3 examples. Here's another one where he's got the leather cap and a little place there for his candle. And again, he's on the edge of a room, saying, this is my room. This one's not quite so obvious. He looks more modern. But again, he's on the edge of a room. And I don't know, he looks a bit more Caucasian, but he's in the right place. And they also left these sort of things, again on the edge of a room, perhaps to ward off evil spirits, little carvings. And this one as well on the edge. And they left tally marks. Now, these are very difficult to see because they've gone back to the substrate colour, the weathered colour. But these seem to be tally marks of how many blocks they're cutting out of the room. And they may well have been paid by the block. And there's about 20 examples of those, but very, very difficult to see them. Medieval minor tally marks. And then we get on to the quality stuff. This is of sort of second degree quality. This chap's copying his badge there. Now, this particular carving was done by John Cameron, who was born in England, Aberdeen, Scotland. Like so many of Canadian soldiers, he's of British origin. His occupation was a moulder, which I'm not sure what that is. Might be something to do with pottery, perhaps. And he got wounded on the 9th of April, like so many of them. He was struck by shrapnel in the neck, but he survived and died as late as 1964. Now, so he carved that. Now, this was a part of the the Vimy Underground DVD. It's been shown on History Channel, and a 92-year-old lady in an old folks' home phoned her son, and this is her son, David Tickner. She phoned her son to say, "I've just seen my father's graffiti on the television." And of course, as there were 5 to 6 million soldiers, and she was 92 and in an old folks' home, David said, "Yes, Mum, take your cocoa and I'll come and see you tomorrow." But fortunately, it was one of these where there was +1 hour and he could watch the show. And he sat in front of his television and saw his own grandfather's graffiti. Now, that is quite remarkable. When you think there's 5 million odd soldiers. And so David flew all the way from Canada to stand next to his own grandfather's graffiti. Now, disobeying all Andy Prada's safety rules, I left him alone in the cave for half an hour so he could be with his grandfather whilst we all went up and had a cup of tea. So that's David. Now, these two boys, Clarence and William Harvey, are brothers. And there they are. There's William, the older one, and there's Clarence. And William had soldier stripes. He had just been promoted to sergeant, but being promoted to sergeant meant that he would have to leave his brother. And so William, although he's got sergeant stripes there, he decided to go back to being a private so he could stay with his brother in the battalion. And they went over the top together on the 9th of April. Unfortunately, both of them were wounded, but Clements died. And William, the family say that William never got over the loss of his younger brother. So it just shows you how you can get some real stories out from this graffiti. And generally speaking, the Canadians have got excellent internet resources. Now, at this point, I'm supposed to check, and I'm running late, Colin, but I'll go faster. This is unique to this cave, never seen before in any other cave, a letterbox that's been carved into the rough wall. Now, when you think that he started with this quality of wall, and they've carved back and shaped this letterbox, and beautifully made it is. It was made on the 16th of March 1917 by Mason and Beckett, two lads working together to make this letterbox. Not seen in any other cave in 20 years. If you ever find another one, there are said to be postcards of this that the Daily Mirror or the Daily Mail produced. If you ever find one, I'd certainly like to see one. They're rumoured to exist. And Beckett was born in London, England. He went out to Canada as a farm labourer and joined up in December 15, but he took a year to get out to France, and he joins the battalion, 15th Battalion, in the field on the 5th of December. Would have had very little battle experience. He might have been stood in the trench for a while, might have been on the odd raid, but his war lasted just 2 or 3 hours, like a lot of them. On the 9th of April, he had a gunshot wound in his left arm, and that took him out of the war for a year. He rejoined his battalion on 7th of September 1918, just a few weeks before the end of the war, survived the war, and was last known to be in Swansea, Ontario. And Mason was born in Cambridge. As a cobbler, he went out to Canada joins up on the 5th of November 1916. His war lasts 2 or 3 hours as well. He got an explosive bullet, caused the amputation of his little right-hand finger. Now, as his little pinky finger. Yeah. So, as a blighty wound, that's not too bad. That's going to get you out the battle, and you might not have to go back again, but it's not exactly life-threatening. But it seems to be slightly worse than it sounds, because he was discharged as medically unfit a year later or so, and sailed back to Ontario, was last known in London, where he died in 1970. So both of these lads survived the war, and that's an amazing piece of carving. Now, in the cave, there's these very poor quality arrows, and they're not up to army standard. And after a bit of research, we realised this is Thomas Cook battlefield tours in the 1920s, because if you follow these arrows round, you have a tour of the cave. So unlike the Clive Harrises and all the other fancy modern guides, the guide in the 1920s stood at the top of the stairs. He sent the lads down. He said, follow the arrows, be back in half an hour, and I'll see you at the top of the stairs. And so they used to go down and have a self-guided tour. And these are some of the boys that did. That chap up there, Crane or something, from Newport, South Wales in September 1930. S. Stowe from Hull in 1931. And this chap, Erw Smith, in the Artist Rifles. And he's saying, like a lot of these lads, he's an ex-soldier. He was here in 1916, and he's come back again in 1924 and 1925. So they're coming back in the 20s on battlefield tours. And one famous chap that did that is Henry Williamson, who I'm sure the more educated amongst you will know was the author of Taka the Otter. He was also an extremely right-wing chap and got interred in the Second World War for his fascist views. But he went back in 1929 on a battlefield tour as an old soldier, and he wrote a book called The Wet Flanders Plain. And in that book, he had one page dedicated to the Maison Blanche. And he's saying here, wandering around, I discovered the Canadian headquarters dugout, which is about 200 yards north of the cave, where the generals waited while the barrage fire rolled up the crest of the Vimy and turned the sleet into steam on the morning of that April day. Now all is silent. A little girl produces stumps of tallow candles and leads the visitor rapidly through one of the big new barns of La Maison Blanche and across the farmyard to 3 rusty sheets of corrugated iron laid on the ground. Underneath is the entrance. Steps, walls, roof are of brick, recently made, for tourists are many, and the dugout is one of the sites of the battlefield. This is 1929, he's writing this, 1929. He's got it slightly wrong in that the entrance wasn't recently made. It might have been recently repaired, but it was there before the war, because we know, because there's sentries have put their graffiti on the bricks near the entrance. And he says, 3 rusty sheets of corrugated iron laid on the ground, 1929. And when we went there 7 years ago, there are 3 rusty sheets of corrugated iron laying on the ground. And that really put the hairs on the back of my head up. I mean, that is such an amazing thing. The only surprise is he's a professional soldier. He's called it corrugated iron. He possibly could have called it wiggly tin, which the soldiers called it. And he could have said this was German wiggly tin, because it's German. And it's got battle damage on it. It's got bullets through it and everything. But those 3 sheets exist to this day, and he wrote about them in 1929. This is extremely rare. I've not seen this in any other cave in 20 years. May 1940, Refuge Belge. So in May 1940, the German army broke through in Belgium, Luxembourg and Holland. And these Belgian refugees are retreating in front of the German army, and they've spent the night in this cave, at least one night. And all around here are their names. What a remarkable thing to find. And these are my 2 favourite girls. This is Titty and Nicole Desire. Although I should say Nicole Desiree or something like that, but it sounds better to say Desire. And these are the last recorded dates that we have, 1958. So that means that the farmer was starting to throw this rubbish in and block the cave in the 1960s. Now, a little plug for this company called Canadime. They have produced this thing here called a gizmo, and they are using very top quality cameras to record all the, particularly the badges on the walls. And this is Roy Lacy. He was a farmer, one of 10 children in Canada. He's come across, he's homesick, and so he's drawn his pig, his chicken somewhere on a horse. And alongside him is this guy, Grant Munro Phelps. And this is a picture of Grant Munro Phelps. They're both up at the 3rd bunk level, very high up. And they're up there together. Unfortunately, Phelps was to be killed on the first morning, on 9th of April. And Lacy died. He survived that battle, but he died in September 1918. But together, they seem to have produced this badge. And it's not too great a quality, but the power of Canadime's photography is such that when you look at it in false light, you start to see a name emerging here. And that name, if you look at his attestation papers, is Erw Lacy. Roy Lacy. So they managed to bring out the fact that he's signed that. Now they take the logic slightly further and they say that this 9 in the badge is similar to the 9 that Phelps drew in his little icon here, and therefore their contention is that Phelps designed the sculpture and Lacy signed it. Might be a leap of faith, but there you are. Shows you the power of modern photography. Now this is the final hurdle to get round. This is real quality stuff. This is the best carvings ever seen in 20 years, and they're done by a chap called Alec, who was a professional mason. And this is the sort of quality that these Canadians can do with their fancy photography. If you look here, the quality of these thistles around that is just amazing when you think he's working in chalk. And he signed his name there. And then the best one of all is this one here. Absolutely superb quality. And it's the result of this actual carving that Yap Films did a documentary they found Alec Ambler's son, and they brought him back to see his own father's carving. Not grandfather, father's carving. And this is, there's one of the Canadime ones, but it got a bit blurred in the production. And this is Alec Ambler, taken in France, January 24th, 1917. He survived the war. He came back to live in England, in my hometown of Edmonton, North London, taking over the family grocer business, and then went back to Canada again.
When they said down, they meant down too, didn't they?
Special precautions are being taken, just in case.
If you do begin to feel you've got trouble breathing, we have got an oxygen kit.
I was supposed to bring oxygen with me, but I didn't.
Yeah.
But it'll be there for me when I get back home.
Right.
Ambler is no stranger to conflict. He served in the RAF during the Second World War.
Yeah, that'll do. Good.
Later, he farmed in Manitoba and worked as an RCMP prison guard.
Oh, I got the rope. Okay.
Yeah, okay. 20 feet left here. See, it opens up over here.
Fantastic. Fantastic.
Does being down here give you a greater appreciation for what he went through in the war?
Oh, yes. By far. I mean, you never... I mean, you know, they say they're in tunnels and that. But you have no idea. I mean, a tunnel, I mean, I thought, well, probably it's a straight tunnel, right? And this is entirely different. to what I expected to see.
But wait no longer. 90 years is enough time. Let's go see it. You recognize the name?
Oh, yes. And his number, eh? Fantastic.
You said he was a natural-born stonemason?
Yeah. Oh, yes. Yes. And when I see this, I can see where he got the decorating for decorating the cakes, right? What amazes me is that he never talked about it. He just said, I got some badges in the trenches, right? And he wasn't too sure whether he'd put his name on all of them or not. I just feel overwhelmed. To the extent, I don't really know what to say. But what do you say when you see something like this that has been lost for so many years and then found, and I've been fortunate enough to see it, right? Oh, isn't that?
I think that's my favorite one.
Yeah, beautiful. That's just fantastic. Oh, it makes me feel very proud of him, right? That I've always been proud of him, but this makes him feel so much closer to him, close enough that I could go in the next room and he would be there, right? So I could just go in there and sit down and talk to him, right? But what I would like to know now, can I get one of these to take back with me? Right? That's what I'd like to have.
Unfortunately, he was dying of lung cancer, and he paid a good fraction of his life savings. He wasn't a particularly wealthy man, to bring his family back, about 10 of them back. I met them at Heathrow and brought them across. Unfortunately, Alec was too ill to come with them, but he did send this lady. She's from the Royal Canadian Mounted Police as a forensic scientist, and she took a mould of the carvings and she went back and created bronze copies, of which I'm very proud to have one here. I can show you. I'll put it at the back later. Don't nick it, it's very heavy. And unfortunately, Alec died about 2 or 3 weeks later, and he died with one of these laying on the bed. So there we are. And that's the end of my talk. Can I just say, though, if I've got 30 seconds more, Colin, just a little plug for Gary Sheffield and Peter Simpkins and John Bourne and all the Hague apologists, because we're coming up now to 4 centenaries of celebrations. They're no doubt going to have to defend the generals in chateaus and the "oh, what a lovely war" and all the poets, etc. They are Hague apologists. They tend to defend Hague and the generals. And I'd just like to say that perhaps the Durand Group in a unique position of asking the soldiers what they thought about this argument, because we have recorded 2,500 items of graffiti on the walls of these tunnels and caves. 2,500. Not a single one is anti the war, anti the generals, anti Hague. They moan about the plum jam, they moan about the sergeant major. They do not say, well, let's stop the war. And no man will carve for 40 hours the cap badge of his regiment if his morale is down. Thank you very much.
Reply to Irish Paddy O, saying Mike Maloney wants to marry me, and so leave the Strand and Piccadilly, or you'll be to blame. For love has fairly drove me silly, hoping you're the same. It's a long way to Tipperary, it's a long way to go. It's a long way to Tipperary, to the Tipperary,